I still fondly remembered my younger cousin, Susie. She was a bubbly girl, with an outgoing attitude and was always curious. She loved going outdoors and always wanted me to take her to places whenever I was around her. It was summer when Susie wanted to go to the museum in the city. Her mother was out for a business trip, and I was tasked to look after her. When her mother agreed to let her go to the museum, I quickly bought our tickets online and we went there the next day. The museum was bustling with activity, with many locals and tourists strolling around and examining museum pieces. Susie was as excited as ever, seeing many children of her age. The incident happened in a particularly narrow corridor. We were walking as normal when a running boy bumped into Susie, which caused her to fall onto and break an old jar. Everybody in the corridor looked at Susie, which made her frightened. As she ran towards me and started weeping, the mother of the running child admitted that it was her son's fault, apologized to everyone in the scene, and brought the matter to the museum staff. At the end, we did not pay for the broken jar, but was astounded to hear from the parent that such a simple jar was valued by the museum at $5,000. Apparently, it was a very old jar owned by an infamous family many decades ago, which has since been handed over to the museum when they died in a car accident. The family was known for establishing sweatshops across the country with very poor safety conditions. Lucky for the parent, the family had insurance cover for the child, who happened to be special needs. Since the incident, Susie tended to keep quiet and shy away from me, for fear that I might get angry at her for breaking the jar. I told her repeatedly that it was not her fault and that the issue was already solved, but whenever I do, she started crying. I could tell that she was blaming herself for the incident. 1 week after the museum visit, my aunt came to my house to pick Susie up. She hugged my aunt tightly on seeing her, as I informed her about what happened in the museum. As I spoke, my aunt and I both noticed that Susie started weeping again. We both felt sorry for her, and my aunt apologized to me that Susie left my place unhappy. On the night of the day when Susie left, I dreamt of a family driving at high speeds in a small town. The parents in the car were screaming at the top of their lungs, arguing about how they should compensate the families of workers who died in a factory they owned. The factory caught fire, which the mother argued was due to safety issues, while the father thought was due to careless workers. As they were arguing, they barely noticed a young girl crossing the road. As the car was about to crash into the young girl, I instantly woke up, disturbed by this nightmare. 2 weeks have since passed when I received an unexpected call from my aunt. Come to the hospital real quick. It was a 30-minute drive to the hospital. Unfortunately for me, when I came, my cousin Susie was already pronounced dead. My aunt hugged me and cried. She died in a car accident. It happened to me when I was a kid. Me, being the only child of my parents, I was pretty close to my grandmother. She loved me a lot. It was pretty common for a family to visit our grandmother's house during school holidays. It was situated outside the city, and it took us a minimum of 8 hours drive before we could reach the place. So we only visited during the breaks. The house was built in the late 80s, so it had a lot of history attached to it, but that didn't concern me much. There was no cell phone back then. The only way of getting connected was a landline phone. It sat near the mantelpiece in the living area. The phone had some weird vibe to it. It always had my attention whenever I was in that area. My grandmother never said anything to me about the old-looking and scratched and dented phone. I didn't even know whether it functioned properly or not. Long story short, we were there for 15 days when this happened to me. One night, when my parents slept in the bedroom upstairs, I heard a ringing in the middle of the night. I couldn't comprehend in the beginning what it was or where it was coming from, but then it struck my mind, and immediately the picture of that old antique phone flashed in front of me. I got out of my bed, went down the stairs, and turned towards the living room, and it stopped. I picked it up, trying to hear the tone, but it was silent, as if it was never functional. I went back upstairs to my bedroom, thinking it was probably just my imagination. That sound was never heard the rest of that night. I refrained from mentioning it during breakfast the next day and couldn't shake it off my mind. 2 weeks passed, and we were to leave the grandma's house the next day. We were packing things, as we had to leave early morning. Just before I was going to bed that night, I heard the ringing again. It was the same. I was sure I wasn't dreaming this time. I slowly came down the stairs, and this time the sound didn't stop, and I picked up the phone. It was silent, but I could hear a faint breathing sound coming from the other side. It very faintly whispered the word, Tom. I put the phone down and went running upstairs, jumped onto the bed, and tightly held onto my blanket. I don't remember going to sleep. The next morning, I mentioned it to my dad. He was shocked when I mentioned the word Tom to him. He told me not to go near that phone ever again, and he said that Tom was the name of the previous owner who had lived on the property and had committed suicide.